all you really need for a feedback loop to work is just a mixer, like we've got here, and one of these. A patch cable. So, all you need to do is connect an output and an input. So, I just connect, I've got the in on this is the main out going to my computer so you can hear this, and we just plug the other output into this input. Let's just put it there since it's the closest one. And the interesting thing now, when we do that, the volume, whether you have a knob or a switch or a dial or whatever, when you pump up the volume, it does something interesting. It makes some sounds. Full disclosure too, also you should know before doing this, there's not real good volume control unless you're using like the headphone output and you're using this, or you have I have a headset with a knob directly on it that I can use to turn up and down the volume, but this can potentially create a very loud, sudden sound, and you don't want it to be so loud that you damage your ears or your equipment. So just be mindful that this can potentially create very loud sounds, and you want to be able to have some sense of volume control while you're doing these experiments. So I digress. When you increase the volume, you can like fine tune it, and when you fine tune it, you make all sorts of wonky sounds. So, yeah, as a kid, just knowing I can do that alone was very fun. And when you adjust, the high, mid, and low frequencies, you can get further twisted sounds. So I will show you that now. So yeah, very fun stuff. That is a very basic feedback loop. That is all you need to get started with these experiments. Just a mixer and a patch cable, and that's it. You can have some fun. But I like to take things further. You can make it even crazier with a way wider range of sounds using the things that I have set on the table here. I can show you. You can have different pedal effects affecting this feedback loop in different ways. You can also use headphone splitters and stuff like that in some more complex setups that I will show you now. Let's just start with a very basic pedal here. Let's do like a reverb pedal here. what we're doing is creating that same feedback loop, but with a pedal in the middle. So now, let's see what happens when we increase the volume now. See, it does sound different. It doesn't sound significantly different, but that definitely is a different sound. Even without the pedal activated in any way. So let's see now what happens when we twist those knobs on the mixer. Okay, so now what about when we do have it activated? How does that affect it? So yeah, very fun. And obviously, depending on the pedal that you use, you'll have different results. And you can experiment with chaining multiple pedals and creating a larger feedback loop with multiple pedals chained together like that. You can also do a different feedback loop, which I will show you how now. You'll notice on some pedals we have, let me find a good example here, like this grunge pedal here. There are two outputs, and we can use that to our advantage when we are making a feedback loop. For this one, we're not going to be using the output of the mixer. Instead, we just plug this pedal in, and we just use a bit of a longer patch cable. You're going to need a little bit longer one than, the very small ones here, but you'll just plug the input and one of the outputs in, and then for the other output, you'll just want it to go to the mixer. I don't think it shouldn't make any sound until you plug or punch the pedal. And then, see, this does actually affect the volume now. But these knobs, including the volume knob on the pedal, affect the different frequencies and sounds that you can get out of the pedal at this point. again, depending on the pedal, you can have all sorts of weird different sounds that are made using that feedback loop technique to create a no input setup. See, normally when you've got a pedal, you've got some sort of input, whether it's a guitar or a synthesizer or a microphone, something that is inputting the sound. But now we are creating a sound just out of the pedal feedbacking into itself. So, of course, depending on whether you're doing it with a distortion pedal or a delay or reverb or whatever, you do all sorts of fun experiments with this knowledge that you've just gained and see what sort of sounds you can create. Another technique, you can use a combination of those two. So, you could just easily, I'll just set this back up, take this a little bit step further, and while this is still plugged in like that, I can just create another feedback loop over here, like we did at the beginning, and now we've got two different feedback loops going simultaneously. And so the way these will affect each other, this will still work like we just saw, but this will just kind of make it louder and more distorted, and we can warp it a bit more than we were just able to. So let me show you that now. So yeah, you can have multiple feedback loops affecting each other in that manner. You can also create a similar feedback loop to this using a pedal that, say, you want to do this, it looks really cool, but you've got a pedal like this where it does not have two outputs. You can still do that if you have a headphone splitter, which I have a plethora of because I've done many no input setup explorations. So for this, you're just gonna, kind of emulate the two outputs. Instead, you just plug this in to that one output, and now essentially you've just got two outputs. So you can plug one of these into here, like we just did here, and plug this into the mixer. And of course, gonna need some power, and you can see what happens then. What's going on there? isn't the best pedal for feedback loops, but just as an example, yeah, you can still do it with one input, or one output rather. And another cool thing I have come to realize is that you can come across these that are the same thing as this, the headphone splitter, except it's got some individual volume controls for the two different inputs. And you can sometimes use those to manipulate the sound further. Yeah. So again, depending on the pedals, you'll get a much more noticeable difference when you're finicking around with a setup like that. That again wasn't the best example, but use your imagination and try with different pedals. Chain pedals together in different ways. You can use, again, like I said, the combination of those two feedback loops. You can even take things really far. You want to make sure also when you're doing this, you can kind of get really complicated with the setup and have a really complex feedback loop with all sorts of intricacies. And the idea, I guess, behind it is that will create a huge variety of sounds that you can potentially unlock exploring those feedback loops. But when it becomes that complex, it can be really hard to keep track of because you're essentially kind of keeping track of which direction the sound is going in, and the sound can loop back into pedals and whatnot. And when you're trying to fidget around with it and keep track of what you're actually doing, it can get really confusing when you've got like this many different feedback loops going on at one time. So try to find that balance between a feedback loop that is complex enough to create a wide variety of sounds while not being so complex that it's difficult to manage. So let's try to do that. Let's try to do that right now here. Let's create a feedback loop setup that is complex, but not so complex that I am just overwhelmed by it and don't want to touch it because it intimidates me. So this is feedbacking into itself using a headphone jack, and then, or using a headphone splitter rather. The second output is going to this pedal, which has two inputs and two outputs. So I take full advantage of that, and I have this simultaneously to taking this pedal as an input, taking itself as an input, using that second output, and this other output goes into another headphone splitter with one of the signals going in to this pedal and the other going into the output. Wait. Wait a minute. Does that make sense? Yeah, so yeah, this is an input. It takes itself as an input and this pedal as an input. Okay. So yeah, it's getting to that point where I'm confusing myself a little bit. That's why I didn't want to add more. I was going to add these 3 more pedals and I was already getting a little bit confused. So see, it's important to realize when you're starting to reach that limit, even with just 3 pedals, it's already starting to get a little complicated and difficult to potentially manage. And the second output is just going to the mixer. So let's see what we can get with all of this in mind. These three pedals, 3 headphone splitters. Yeah, 3, 1, 4 headphone splitters. Some patch cables, but no inputs. No inputs, just feedback loops, all by itself. Okay. So we did some interesting things there, I guess, but I feel like I can just trade out this pedal entirely. I really didn't get a whole lot of value out of that being in there. think that does a good beginner explanation as to what a feedback loop is, what a no input setup can look like, and all the different, types of feedback loops and the different ways that you can combine them and create a unique no input setup that can be twisted and manipulated into making all sorts of weird sounds. You can always, you just saw, I didn't like how that last pedal sounded, so I changed it out for this one. I'm much more satisfied with how that sounded. You can always add more pedals, get rid of them, change them out with different ones. All sorts of things, just trying to hone in on what sort of sound you like to be coming out of that no input setup. So I hope I have inspired some of you to try some of this out. You can just get some pedals, get some chords, make some sounds. You don't need to learn how to play a guitar to make a noise album. So all you need is something like this, and the time and willpower to put forth that energy into creativity. So again, this is Princess Dog Vomit signing off. This has been a no input / feedback loop tutorial. Catch you later. Bye.